I'd first like to thank the conference organizers for their ongoing support and efforts in pivoting this conference into a virtual format. So I'd like to get us started off in a good way with our land acknowledgement. As a guest on Turtle Island, I would like to start by acknowledging that we are connecting virtually today from our spaces on land that has been shared with us, so that we may work and learn together in the service of students who attend our schools. These schools are on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence in this space continues to this day. We also would like to acknowledge the treaty lands negotiated as the Williams Treaty and Treaty 13, and thank the signatory nations, respectively, for sharing these lands with us. We would also like to acknowledge the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation as our closest First Nation community and our partners in education. So just a little bit about me. My name is Jordan Rappaport. I've been an educator for 16 years and currently serve as a teacher and math coach in Toronto, Canada, as well as being the lead math mentor at The Mentoree, which is an online teacher mentorship community. My passion for mathematics education was sparked once I had kids of my own, leading to a profound interest in teaching for understanding and the development of student thinking and reasoning. This is framed around the role playful mathematics has in uncovering a sense of wonder, belief, and beauty. As an educator, my work is predicated on the belief that all learners have mathematical experiences that need to be honored, and using these experiences will help to leverage new learning opportunities for our students. But it's more than that. I believe we need to provide students with opportunities to solve meaningful problems that are accessible to all learners, and to engage with students in mathematics challenges that have multiple entry points, a low floor, and a high ceiling. And I believe as a starting point for us today, given the variety of contexts many of us are working under, now, more than ever, learning experiences for students need to be framed so they're contextual, meaningful, impactful, grounded in teaching through problems worth solving, the big ideas, and the development of mathematical reasoning. We'll first start off by looking at a framework for planning and teaching that can be applied to face-to-face, through a distance learning model, or a hybrid of the two. Following that, we'll have opportunities to engage in a series of tasks and activities, during which time we'll look at a 5-step developing reasoning continua, which provides a framework for assessing for student understanding. Through this process, we'll aim to develop questions and prompts to consider in order to continue moving student learning forward and to address student thinking and current conceptions. We're then going to observe students engaging in the same series of tasks and activities, and using the framework for assessing for understanding, identify where on the 5-step developing reasoning continua students were on, along with considerations for next steps. Now, I recognize that planning for meaningful and playful mathematics through our various contexts can be a lot to unpack. So let's break that down. So we're going to look at some guiding principles to help frame our thinking. So we need to be asking ourselves, as we are selecting tasks and activities, is the problem accessible for all students? Does this problem encourage the use of multiple entry points? Are students able to access the problem at their level and experience success? Does this problem allow for the use of multiple strategies and varying facets of mathematics? Does this problem provide opportunities for students to make connections to key mathematics principles? If so, which ones? In a mathematical context, the big ideas can be defined as the interrelated concepts that form a framework for learning mathematics in a coherent way. These are oftentimes referred to as the key principles of math. For instance, big ideas could include patterns and relationships between big ideas. So for our session today, we'll be focusing on the interrelationships between fractions, proportional reasoning, algebraic reasoning, and spatial reasoning. By framing math learning opportunities for students through a relational approach rooted in the interrelationships between these key ideas, I believe we're creating a strong foundation to continue to support the development of mathematical reasoning through whatever model or context we're currently working within. Now, unfortunately, it's not as simple as that given our current circumstances. There are far more considerations now, such as context and accessibility, to name just two. Now we need to ask ourselves, are students able to access the learning opportunities we're crafting for them, either through technology or through their own entry points? Will students and families find meaning behind the learning experiences we're crafting for them? Will students and families find connections with and between the work they're engaged in? Will students and families see value? Will students find excitement in these learning opportunities? And on top of that, will these experiences support different family contexts so there is minimal impact on how families are coping? So, again, a lot to think about and a lot to digest. So, in the spirit of keeping this manageable for us, let's take a look at some examples of activities and resources that I have found particularly valuable in planning for meaningful and impactful learning opportunities. As students build their number sense throughout elementary school, they're given opportunities to make connections between different quantities, which support them in deepening their understanding of proportionality. In secondary school, students use this as a foundation for understanding mathematical relationships in algebra. Kyle Pierce has a treasure trove of tasks and activities to support the progression of fractions in learners, really from K to 12. You can see his Twitter handle on the left-hand side, as well as his website in the slide as well. The beauty of his work is that the tasks and units follow the three-act math task framework. So, as an example, if we are teaching through a distance learning model, oftentimes what I have found is we can, let's say, provide Act 1 in week 1, Act 2 the next week, and then what I found is that for many students, this often leaves them coming back for more. Nat Banting has curated a website built around talk and student action. These two principles guide the teacher's questions, disposition, and facilitation of the activity. So we can see Nat's website up here, fractiontalks.com. They can become a daily routine or used for entire lessons. One common structure is much like a number talk. Students are provided with an image, a section or sections are shaded, and students are asked, what fraction is shaded? Students then develop an answer supported with reasoning. And again, depending on the context or the model that we're working with under, this can be done either through, to just name a few, a Google form, or students can send you a video of their reasoning and solution. Due to their explicit interrelationships, many of the tasks and activities developed by Kyle Pierce naturally lend themselves to the ideas and lines of thinking embedded in proportional reasoning. This provides students with opportunities to reflect on and make connections to different key principles in math. So while they may be working on a different task or puzzle, how we frame and sequence learning experiences for students will give them an opportunity to naturally see these connections. The essence of proportional reasoning is the consideration of using numbers in relative terms, rather than absolute terms. Students use proportional reasoning early in math learning. For instance, when they think of 8 as 2 4s or 4 2s, rather than thinking of it as 1 more than 7. They use proportional reasoning later in learning when they think of how a speed of 50 kilometers an hour is the same speed as 25 kilometers in 30 minutes. Students continue to use proportional reasoning when they think of slopes of lines and rates of change. We also see an activity here called turbo texting, which I've used in a classroom setting on 2 different occasions in 2 completely different ways. This task is from John Orr, who's partnered with Kyle Pierce. John's website, mrorrisageek.com, is populated with 3-act tasks in a similar way to Kyle Pierce's. In their website, Make Math Moments, they've curated their tasks and activities in such a way that supports planning for distance learning, a hybrid model, or face-to-face. And just want to let everyone know as well, any website or any resource or source that I mentioned, there will be a slide towards the end, sort of like a credit slide, that will show where I've sourced out all of these tasks and activities from. Algebraic reasoning is a gatekeeper for students in their efforts to progress in mathematics and science. An early introduction gives all students more opportunities in later mathematics and career choices, and it may serve to support the transition from formal algebra in secondary grades, which research has shown to be difficult for many students. Algebraic reasoning permeates all of mathematics. So again, structuring and sequencing tasks and activities in a purposeful and intentional way will give students opportunities to make connections between different areas of math. On the slide, we see 2 activities. The first one is a math walk, which is a website curated by Tracy Jackson, which supports, among other things, developing algebraic reasoning in a meaningful, impactful, and engaging way. The site is added to all the time, and it is a go-to for me in my planning for students. Beside the example of the math walk is a classic problem from Enrich Maths. We have a 3 by 3 by 3 cube, which we fully submerge in a can of orange paint or really any color. And when we take it out of the paint, for whatever reason, we decide to smash the cube on the floor. We can then ask our students, what color are the faces of the 27 cubes now? This is a wonderful example of a low floor, high ceiling task that I've used with students as young as 6, all the way through to grade 8. Not only does a task like this support the development of algebraic reasoning, it provides a concrete opportunity for students to engage in the task. So for some of our younger learners, we can think of, let's say, using something like sugar cubes with food coloring to be able to model the problem. And research is definitive around how students learn math. We begin with the concrete, then progress to the visual or representational, then move along the developmental continuum to the abstract. And finally, we need to consider tasks and activities to support the development of spatial reasoning. Spatial reasoning can be described as the ability to describe, use, and visualize the effects of putting together and taking apart shapes. This is important because composing and decomposing units and higher order units are fundamental mathematics. Plus, there is transfer. The composition of shapes supports children's ability to compose and decompose numbers. To build on one of the points I mentioned in the previous slide, we all learn mathematics through a developmental process. We start with the concrete, so we can think about young students playing with blocks or perhaps even magnet tiles. We then move on to the visual or the representational, so we can think about a student using diagrams or drawings to illustrate the thinking. Then we move to the abstract, such as using symbolic notations to represent different quantities. Mark Chubb and Sarah Carter, whose work is shown on the slide, have created and curated various games, activities, and puzzles to support the development of spatial reasoning. What research also tells us is that the development of this skill is malleable. So whatever age you are or experience you have, the skill can always be developed. So by building mathematics programming with playful mathematics as the foundation, students are provided with meaningful and enjoyable context so they can make sense of and mathematize their world. By framing learning experiences for students, supporting the development of reasoning and communication as the focal point, our learners are better equipped to make conjectures, justify solutions with increased precision. So now let's shift things just a little bit. So what do Bill Gates, the Beatles, and Wayne Gretzky have in common? Well, without question, I think we can all agree they're world famous. Some might even call them masters of what they do. They were and are driven by their passion and love for their craft. But we need to ask ourselves, how did they get there? As youngsters pursuing their love and passion, they played, and they played a lot. And most importantly, they played in a fun environment that nurtured their curiosity and passion. Given that I'm a big sports fan, let's take a little bit more of a closer look at how Gretzky developed his skills. For Gretzky, practicing in a fun and meaningful way for him helped to nurture a lifelong passion and love for the game. In a mathematics classroom, this is what we should be striving for in all of our learners. As teachers, we need to be designing learning opportunities for students to play and have fun so they develop a lifelong love and pursuit of mathematics. In his article, Mathematics Just Play, Sunil Singh pens how Gretzky has commented on the current state of the game and how it is overcoached with so much emphasis on positional play and drills, all of which are important, but only so if they do not impact and jeopardize on the pure fun and joy found in the game. In a math class, this is akin to the hockey culture and thinking that Gretzky bemoans about. Little play and zero fun. By approaching mathematics through a more procedural framework before building conceptual understanding, students might give what Mike Flynn calls the illusion of understanding. It's the idea that kids can seem like they're understanding math by providing correct answers, but they may not actually understand it, and instead have just memorized facts, rules, and procedures. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit deeper into this by going through a grade 5 test on fractions, decimals, and percents. Here we see the first page, or the first page that we're going to be looking at, of the assessment. For context, The pre-assessment, classwork, and any practice test questions are all aligned with the types of questions that we'll see and the layout of the test. Okay, so we're going to go, it's about 3 or 4 slides, okay? And as we go through it, to help frame our thinking, let's have one guiding question at the back of our minds. Okay, so as we go through each of the pages, we need to ask ourselves, what information is this giving me about this particular student? Okay, so here we see the first page that we're looking at, and let's sort of ask ourselves and reflect on what information is this giving me about this particular student? Let's have a look at the next page. Okay, same guiding question. What information is this giving me about this particular student? Okay, page 3, same question. What information is this giving me about this particular student? Okay, here's the last page. And just for context, as we can see, there's one question that hasn't been answered, one question that has been answered. So students had a choice as far as which of question 10 or 11 they wanted to answer, and then they went ahead and answered that question. Okay, so based on that common guiding question, what information is this giving me about this particular student? Having looked at the different sample questions and how the student responded, what do we now know? What do we now know about this student in the context of the test? So I think some of the things that we saw was the student can determine the least common multiple, student can order different quantities, can convert fractions, and then there's a few other things in there as well. But we need to ask ourselves, is this because the student understands what they're doing or because they're familiar with the procedures? Now, I think we can make assumptions either way, but do we really have a sense of this student's thinking and understanding? Truthfully, I'm not sure we really do because unfortunately, oftentimes we equate familiarity with understanding. In his article, A Few Simple Beliefs, Mark Chubb states that we have all become educators because we want our students to be successful, and we want our students to do our best and to help them do well. However, we're often so eager to get the results that we want that we don't take enough time to allow our students to think, to explore, to make sense of the math, to realize why we're learning what we're learning. In our eagerness to have our students get answers, we often miss the developmental pieces that our students need to be successful. And if the goal is to reliably get answers for questions involving computation, the best and most reliable means to do this is to pull out a smartphone or calculator. But we can't be teaching just for the sake of getting answers. To support the development of mathematical reasoning, we must be teaching for understanding. And this begins with playful mathematics. In Ontario, which is where I'm from, the Ontario Ministry of Education defines mathematical reasoning as a process that supports deeper understanding of mathematics by enabling students to make sense of the mathematics they're learning. This involves exploring phenomena, developing ideas, making mathematical conjectures, and justifying results. The ability to think and reason is an essential factor in the development of an individual's ability to understand and apply mathematics. While students may be able to solve problems with a memorized procedure, they may not have developed the necessary skills towards building a deep knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of key math concepts. They might just be good at steps or procedures, but might not understand the math behind what they've done. And I believe that's what we saw in the example from a few moments ago. Now, developing reasoning skills with young learners is very complex. They need to learn to become systematic thinkers and also acquire the ability to articulate such thinking in a clear, succinct, and logical manner. Enrich's Maths identifies a 5-step progression in reasoning, a spectrum that allows us to determine whether children are moving on in their reasoning trajectory. Children are unlikely to move fluidly from one step to the other. Rather, they flow up and down the spectrum, settling on a particular step that best describes their reasoning skills at any one time. So on the screen right now, we see what those 5 steps are. And so let's just take a moment to familiarize ourselves with the verbs at the beginning of each of the steps. So describing, explaining, convincing, justifying, and proving. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at how we can take a simple puzzle and generate a discussion to support the development and assessment of student reasoning. Okay, so here we have a large rectangle, which is divided into a series of smaller quadrilaterals and triangles. Each of the shapes is a fractional part of the large rectangle. And we can ask students, what fraction of the shape appears to be shaded? Okay. So not only are we looking, I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. So not only are we looking for evidence of where students or where this particular student falls on the progression of reasoning continua through the lens of assessing for understanding. So I'm just going to jump ahead a couple of slides. We're going to come back to this in a sec. Some guiding principles that we need to be considering to support teaching through a lens of assessing for understanding. So when students are engaged in a task, we need to be asking ourselves, what are we looking for? How do we know when we see it? How will we respond to what students are doing or saying? And what questions or prompts will support the development of student thinking? Okay, so those are just some pieces that as students are engaged, we always need to be very mindful of so we can support students and be responsive to what they're doing in real time. Okay, so take a minute to pause the video, pause the presentation to work through the task. Okay, so we've got the large rectangle on the right divided into a series of smaller quadrilaterals and triangles. Each of the shapes is a fractional part of the large rectangle. What fraction of the shape appears to be shaded? Take whatever time you need as you work through it. Once you feel as though you have a solution, just hit play and we'll continue on. Okay, now by making this, so what we've just done, so by engaging in a task before we engage with students and making this a regular part of our practice, we're giving ourselves an opportunity to really focus in on these 4 principles of teaching and assessing for understanding. Now we'll have a better sense of what to look for to represent or to recognize student learning or any current conceptions that they happen to have, and to be responsive to the needs of students in the moment. So I'm wondering if you see the potential for any student misconceptions and how we might address those through questioning and prompts.
So the way I got this was technically I ignored this line and I added up all the rectangles, and then I looked at this one specifically and I saw that a piece of it wasn't missing. I meant a piece of it was missing, and then I saw that over here was identical to this one, so it would be the same as putting this one here, which would complete the one and would make 1, and since there's 12, then it would be 1 out of 12.
Okay, so based on what we just heard, where might the student be on the progression of reasoning continua? Is she simply describing what she did? Is she explaining her process while offering up some reasons? Or is she providing a convincing and confident argument showing a progression of mathematical thinking? Is she at the latter stages of the continua by justifying her strategy and solution? Or has she provided sound proof with an argument that is reasoned with mathematics? Okay, so just take a minute to reflect on those steps and where the student might be. And wherever she is on the continua, we have clear evidence of her thinking and reasoning and can confidently identify for the student where they can go next. And here's an example of where we could consider going next to support the development of this student's thinking and reasoning. So here we have a large rectangle, which is divided into a series of smaller quadrilaterals and triangles. And we can ask students, how many ways can you shade 1/8? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a look at another task. Okay. Here we have the classic Towers of Hanoi, which is a puzzle consisting of 3 rods and a number of discs of different sizes, which can slide onto any rod. The puzzle starts with the discs in a neat stack in ascending order of size on one rod, the smallest on the top. The objective of the puzzle is to move the entire stack to another rod in the fewest moves possible by obeying the following simple rules. Number 1, only one disc can be moved at a time. Number 2, each move consists of taking the upper disc from one of the stacks and placing it on top of another stack or on an empty rod. Number 3, no larger disc may be placed on top of a smaller disc. Now, not to worry if you don't happen to have a class set of Hanoi towers lying around. 3 pieces of tape and really any objects of different sizes will work, as we see here with what I did with 2 of my own kids. Not that I happen to have sets of relational rods lying around, but as we prepared to transition to a distance learning model, I made sure to have some at home to play with. Okay, so in a second, let's pause so that you can get 3 pieces of tape and 3 objects of any sizes so that you can try to move the entire stack from another rod, or to another rod, I should say, in the fewest moves possible, again, by following these rules. The objective of the puzzle is to move the entire stack to another rod in the fewest moves possible. Number 1, only one disc can be moved at a time. Number 2, each move consists of taking the upper disc from one of the stacks and placing it on top of another stack or on an empty rod. Number 3, no larger disc may be placed on top of a smaller disc. Okay, so pause here and take some time to work through this task. Okay, and then once you feel as though you have a solution, okay, just hit play again and we'll continue on. So by again taking the time to engage in the task before students, as educators, we're better equipped to incorporate the principles of teaching and assessing for understanding in order to be responsive to student thinking and understanding. So what might we be looking for here as we observe students? How might we respond? Think about some of the questions and prompts that could support student thinking. And after perhaps a few tries, we can see that with 3 discs, the puzzle can be solved in 7 moves. So now we're going to go to the next slide and take a quick listen to some of my oldest son's thinking and reasoning after moving the entire stack.
Can you tell us how you knew, Micah, to move the rods in the way that you were moving them?
I moved them in that way because the smallest one, it can go either on the second or the third piece of tape, so I moved it onto the third, and then I knew I had to move the second rod onto the second piece of tape, and then if I wanted to move the biggest rod, I would have to move the smallest rod onto the green rod, then I'd move the maroon rod over to the third piece of tape, and I would move the smallest one here because then I have access to moving this one over here, and then I could just move this one here.
So coming back to the progression of reasoning continua, how might we best describe my son's thinking and reasoning? Now, in the absence of any follow-up questions, he's likely at step 2 or step 3. But we would need to follow up as we likely don't have enough evidence yet to make that assessment. Okay, so take a minute to reflect on where might we go next to support my son or to support a student in this situation. So we went with 4 rods. And in the spirit of productive struggle and managing flow, he went at trying to move the entire stack in the fewest moves possible. And after several tries, he just wasn't seeing it yet. So let's think about what moves could we invoke to support his thinking and understanding while at the same time keeping him in the flow of the task. Okay, so just reflect on that for a minute. What could we do as teachers to support him? So one move to consider would be to lower the floor just a little bit to give him an entry point that's more accessible for him. So first we went to two rods and decided to create a table to chart and keep track of what we were doing. And then we went down to one rod. So now things are beginning to open up for him. Now he's able to visualize that perhaps there's a pattern he might be looking for. So based on what we see, his thinking is developing, and he's actually making a conjecture around the number of moves for n number of rods. So now, based on what we've heard, the teacher moves for us to consider, and what we're seeing on the table, where might he fall in the continuum now? How might we respond to what we see and what he might be doing? And what questions and prompts could support the development of his thinking and reasoning? Now, if we look closely, we can see that there's a little bit of a misconception in there. So in the spirit of productive struggle, we can let him play around with it a little bit until he realizes his conjecture can't be supported with evidence, or we can provide him with a clue to manage flow. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at one last task. Here we have a star made up of several smaller triangles, and we can ask students, how many triangles do you see in the star? How can you be sure? So just pause here and take a few minutes to try to solve. And then when you feel as though you have a solution or you've worked through the task, okay, just hit play, and we're going to move on to a video of a student explaining their thinking. Okay, now, to throw a little bit of a wrench into how we can support our students, what happens when the communication is nonverbal? How might we determine where a student who is demonstrating their thinking in a nonverbal way, where they might fall on the progression of reasoning continua? And that's what we're going to see on the next slide. So again, based on what we just saw, where might this student fall in the progression of reasoning continua? Now, again, there would likely need to be an opportunity for a follow-up conversation, but we do have evidence to support where we could go next with the student based on their thinking through the problem. So through the careful selection of playful mathematics, we can encourage and support strategic mathematical thinking as students investigate strategies for solving problems and deepen their understanding of concepts and ideas. When students have opportunities to engage in playful tasks repeatedly and in different and more complex ways, we are bridging the gap between conceptual understanding and the development of computational fluency. And as noted by hockey legend Wayne Gretzky, kids are motivated to practice when opportunities to practice are fun and spark curiosity. In this way, playful mathematics can present opportunities for practice, often without the need for teachers to provide the problems. This then provides us as educators with opportunities to observe or assess students in order to support the development of their reasoning and thinking. And whether it's a youngster exploring with magnetiles, or students actively engaging with different quantities, or trying to figure out how many donuts are in a massive box, engaging students in meaningful and playful mathematics supports the development of mathematical reasoning while uncovering for students the beauty of mathematics. Thank you.